Is private investment expected to rise? Will the tax incentives and other measures announced in the budget help spur consumer demand? With the government providing a tax stimulus through income tax breaks to boost consumer spending and RBI cutting interest rates for the first time in nearly 5 years, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman on Saturday said she was quite optimistic of the tide turning on private investments in the months to come. Addressing the media, she said, anecdotal evidence suggests a pickup in the investment activity. Ms. Sitharaman said she had heard from different sources that orders for fast moving consumer goods for the period April to June were already getting booked, and that industry is clearly seeing the signs of a possible recovery of consumption. Private investment in India, which has been on a downward trajectory for more than a decade, showed further signs of weakening in the latest quarter. Private investment plans dropped by 1.4% in December 24-25 quarter, even though investments overall increased by 9.9% due to significant rise in public investments by center and state governments, who grew by 11.8% and 34.6%. Private investment matters because it helps build physical, human, and other forms of capital that ultimately help increase the amount of goods and services produced in an economy. It should be noted that private investment is generally considered to be more efficient than public investment, which is undertaken by the government. This is because private investments are subject to discipline of profits and losses in the marketplace, which ensure that capital is allocated towards the most urgent needs of the consumers. Public investments are not subject to the same degree of market discipline, but notably, public investment is viewed as a major reason behind the high growth numbers reported in India in recent years. What determines private investment? It is generally believed that money deposited as savings in banks by ordinary citizens is loaned out to fund large scale investments. But in reality, private investment depends not on savings level in the economy, but on the pace at which loans are created by the banking sector. This is because banks can create loans electronically through simple accounting entries that deposit money in borrowers' accounts even without savings to back these loans. So there is a strong positive relationship between bank credit growth and level of private investment, with healthy bank credit growth driving sector investment higher. In fact, bank credit growth averaged about 22% between 2005 and 14 when economic growth was high before dropping precipitously to just around 9% between 2014 and 2021 when the economy began to slow down. Why has private investment been sluggish? Many economists have blamed the lack of sufficient consumer demand for the lack of strong private investment in the country. They argue that unless the government does something to increase the amount of money that consumers have in their hands to spend, investors would be unwilling to take the risk of investing in business projects. Given this backdrop, making incomes up to 12 lakh tax free is seen as an attempt to put more money in the hands of the individuals to boost consumer spending and spur private investment. However, over the decades, there has been an inverse negative relationship between private investment and consumer spending. Private final consumption expenditure stood at high of 90% of GDP way back in 1950-51, from where it dropped gradually over the decades to hit a low of 54.7% of GDP in 2010-11. At the same time, private investment as a percentage of GDP rose from around 10% in the decades between independence and economic liberalization to around 27% in 2007-8. Interestingly, from around the time when private investment hit a peak in 2011-12, private consumer spending has actually risen, not fallen. In other words, over the last decade or so, consumer spending has actually risen at the same time that private investment has dropped from its peak. This suggests that negative relationship between private investment and consumer spending could simply be due to the money in an economy that the money in an economy that is not invested is spent on consumption, and vice versa. Given this, policy uncertainty and unfriendly government policies are cited as major reasons behind the slowdown in private investment. Many analysts have pointed to the drop in pace of economic reforms as discouraging private investors from undertaking long-term capital-intensive projects. What will be the impact of Trump's trade war? Why has US announced steep tariffs on imports from China, Canada, and Mexico? What are the potential risks to such measures? How will it affect world trade? And how has China responded in the case of Mexico and Canada? Does it violate the free trade pact that they have with the US? US President Donald Trump has sought to deliver in the early days of his second term in office on his most vociferous campaign promise to slap a range of the US trading partners with significant tariffs in a bid to tamp down on undocumented migrant and illicit drug inflows, while presumably incentivizing companies to favor creating jobs on the US soil. His administration's initial action in the space to use executive orders to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods and a 10% tax on energy products from Canada and a wide range of goods from China roiled stock markets across the world, especially in Asia, as Beijing vowed to file a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization against the US for wrongful practice, and Ottawa and Mexico City announced the plans for retaliatory tariffs. Mr. Trump appeared to back down from his position. Following discussions with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum and Canadian officials, Mr. Trump said the White House has agreed to pause the tariff action for a month in the wake of Mexico committing 10,000 National Guard troops to man its northern border, and a longer term bilateral deal in the works. Similarly, a 30-day pause on the tariff action would be applied to Canada, given its Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's commitment to work together as his government sought to appoint a fentanyl czar, list Mexican cartels as terrorist groups, and launched a Canada-US joint strike force to combat organized crime, fentanyl, and money laundering. Mr. Trump said the White House has agreed to pause the tariff action for a month in the wake of Mexico committing 10,000 National Guard troops to man its northern border, and longer-term bilateral deal in the works. Similarly, 30-day a pause on tariff action would be applied to Canada. Given its Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's commitment to work together as government sought to appoint a fentanyl czar, list Mexican cartels as terrorist groups, and launch Canada-US Joint Strike Force to combat organized crime. While the tariffs on Chinese goods are enforced, Mr. Trump temporarily exempted small value packages imported from there after the US Postal Service was plunged into chaos as it struggled to deal with the new regulations. What is the broader context of the tariffs? Although in the traditional macroeconomic policy context, tariffs are imposed to rectify trade imbalances due to artificial price barriers, the justification given by Trump White House for the tariff plan was that it would address the national emergency resulting from the extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including deadly fentanyl. This expensive reasoning for imposing tariffs across the board potentially risk blowback from other nations, inevitable retaliatory tariffs. The resulting trade war could seriously dampen world trade at a precarious time for global economic growth prospects. The irony is that escalating tit for tat tariffs will likely exert strong upward pressure on the prices that US consumers pay for imported products and ignite a broader inflationary trend through the higher input prices across industries. The second cause for concern of the Trump administration's tariff plan is that it tacitly endorses the weaponization of tariffs as a countermeasure against unrelated inter-country disputes. In this case, the inflow of unsanctioned migration and illegal drugs rather than rely on traditional law enforcement activity to ensure less porous borders. According to White House, Mexican drug trafficking organizations have to have an intolerable alliance with the government of Mexico and that the latter has afforded safe havens for the cartels to engage in the manufacturing and transportation of dangerous narcotics, which collectively have led to the overdose of deaths of hundreds and thousands of American victims. The Trump administration has also said that there is growing presence of Mexican cartels operating fentanyl and nitrazine synthesis labs in Canada, with a recent study recognizing Canada's heightened domestic production of fentanyl and its growing footprint within international narcotics distribution. The facts, according to Mr. Trump's administration, suggest that this is an alliance that endangers national security of the US, requiring the eradication of influence of these dangerous cartels. Perhaps emboldened by his success in forcing Colombia to accept deportees from the US flown to Bogota via military aircraft, Mr. Trump has used tariffs to bring Mexico and Canada to the negotiating table, even if his proposal violates the terms of the US Mexico Canada Free Trade Pact. Mexico has now already deployed the most, if not all, of the promised troops to surveil and protect the US border from unauthorized crossings. Reports also suggest that Mexican authorities have seized 20 million doses of fentanyl since Ms. Sheinbaum's term began in October. Mr. Trudeau initially responded with greater defiance, announcing retaliatory tariff of 106 billion worth of imports from the US, despite reportedly being told that Canada could avoid tariffs by becoming the 51st member of the US. He revived a broader security package said to be worth $900 billion, announced last year and promised to appoint a fentanyl czar. Where does the China stand? Mr. Trump's 10% tariff levy on Chinese products is relatively modest compared to the 60% tariff rate that he had earlier threatened to hit Beijing. Nevertheless, China was quick to announce a 15% counter tariff to be levied upon imports of US coal and liquefied natural gas, crude oil, agricultural machinery, and certain cars, measures that are set to kick in on February 10. In a more expansive counterattack, Chinese government further opened an antitrust probe into Google, placed several top US fashion and biotech companies on an unreliable entities list, and set limits on exports of critical minerals for high-tech products. Nevertheless, analysts suggest that both sides have refrained from excessive or knee-jerk reactions, even though the US tariffs on China adds to the pre-existing levies imposed by Mr. Trump during his first term, and this leaves room for maneuver in negotiations that may follow when Mr. Trump meets Chinese President Xi Jinping in the near future. However, with Mr. Trump promising stringent tariff action against the EU and other reciprocal tariffs against all trading partners of the US in the days ahead in his mission to level the playing field, the risk of trade skirmishes derailing global growth prospects remain high. Are freebies and welfare schemes different? Can schemes such as midday meal, public distribution system, and child development services be considered as welfare? How do targeted cash transfers impact lives? And what are fiscal risks of freebie driven politics? All three major political parties in Delhi Assembly election unveiled a barrage of freebies or subsidies to woo voters. Aam Aadmi Party placed 2100, additional 21,000 for pregnant women, subsidized LPG cylinders at 500 for those with impoverished backgrounds. BJP followed suit, 2500 to women with low income families, and free electricity through its solar energy initiative. The core challenge in this debate is the absence of a clear consensus on what constitutes Freebies. Some argue that freebies amount to bribery and discourage voters from making informed choices. Others, however, claim that such narrative strips voter of their agency and delegitimizes welfare politics. What some perceives as a freebie may be regarded as a welfare by others. For instance, while one segment of a society may view free transport as a unwarranted concession, for another it constitutes a vital welfare measure. Ironically, those who criticize free transport as a subsidy often benefit from the availability of cheap labor. Affordable transport enables people to travel in search of work, making such labor possible. The National Food Security Act, enacted by the Congress-led UPA government in 2013, transformed key welfare schemes such as midday meal, public distribution system, and child development services into legal entitlements. According to data released by Center, the law's beneficiaries include 75% of rural population and 50% of the urban population, roughly 800 million people in total. 23 study by Center for Financial Inclusion found that carefully designed cash transfer programs which channel funds directly to women on behalf of their households not only empower women but also help mitigate the risk of intimate partner violence. According to Dr. Kailash, welfare provisions, unlike freebies, enhance human capabilities and freedoms, aligning with capability approach to development propounded by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. For instance, access to nutritious, free food through midday meal schemes strengthen immunity and enables individuals to lead dignified life. In contrast, poor health not only causes personal suffering but also burdens public resources by increasing the demand for hospitals and medical treatment. Investing in nutrition from an early age yields significant long-term benefits for both individuals and society. Cash transfer schemes have recently found electoral success in Maharashtra, Jharkhand, and Haryana. However, Dr. Kailash cautioned that while such schemes stimulate market activity, by boosting consumer spending, they ultimately fall short of creating genuine economic opportunities. Freebies driven politics pose a serious fiscal threat, particularly to heavy indebted state governments. RBI's latest report highlights such measures have led to sharp increase in subsidy expenditure. It further urges states to rationalize these subsidies to ensure they do not displace critical investments. Radhika Pandey, associate professor, cautioned the growing reliance on freebies will inevitably deepen the revenue deficit for states. Delhi reported a revenue surplus of 14,000 in 22-23, 23-24. The figure was significantly lower at 5,700, with revised estimates reflecting a further 13% decline. In for 24-25 projected surplus stands at just 3,300 crores, sharp 35% drop. With the rising fiscal burden of freebies, the revenue deficit is likely to slip into deficit unless states substantially scale up their revenue generation. She further pointed out wide array of freebies promised, including cash transfer for women, pensions for senior citizens, subsidized electricity, with increased annual expenditure. In August 22, Supreme Court referred to a series of petitions challenging the constitutional validity of electoral freebies. The lead petition filed by BJP leader Yashwini Upadhyay contended such populist measures undermine the constitutional guarantee of free and fair elections. During the proceedings, the bench led by Chief Justice N.V. Ramanna suggested forming an expert panel to solicit recommendations. This marked a significant departure from court's earlier position. In Subramaniam's Balaji versus Government of Tamil Nadu 2013, Supreme Court ruled that such matters fell within the domain of legislative policy and were beyond judicial scrutiny. It further underscored that such expenditure could neither be deemed unlawful nor characterized as corrupt practice, particularly since they sought to advance the DPSP. However, there has been no effective hearing to the challenge since November 23, 2023. According to senior advocate Sanjay Hegde, there is a little that courts can do to distinguish welfare measures from populist SOPs and pre-election inducements. It is legislature's prerogative to rein in to unchecked competitive populism. The judiciary should not intervene in the choices made between the voters and their elected representatives, it said. So, see you in the next one.